Everyone remembers Norm Peterson, the guy who walked into the Cheers bar and instantly made it feel like home. But how much do you really know about the man behind the character? Because behind his amazing performance on Cheers was a man whose life was more complicated, more human, and far more private than most people ever realized. But what exactly happened to him after the cameras stopped rolling? George Wendt faced silent battles, career struggles, and health challenges that only a few knew about. And now, 32 years after the final episode of Cheers, George Wendt has passed away, and the questions he left behind are heavier than most people expected. The road to Cheers fame. It's been 32 years since Cheers aired its final episode, and just recently, the world said goodbye to the man who brought Norm Peterson to life, George Wendt. But most fans don't realize that George had a journey unlike any other. His path to television fame wasn't carved out of privilege or planning. It was actually messy and completely unexpected. George Wendt was born on October 17, 1948, on the south side of Chicago, Illinois. He grew up in a large, traditional Irish-American family with 9 siblings. His father was a Navy officer and realtor, and his grandfather had been a prominent local figure. However, George's early life wasn't marked by spotlight dreams or grand ambition. In fact, acting wasn't even on his radar during his youth. He was an average student, a quiet observer, and someone who seemed to blend into the crowd more than stand out from it. After high school, he enrolled at the University of Notre Dame, but things didn't go quite as planned. In what would become an infamous turning point in his life, he was expelled during his very first semester with a GPA of exactly 0 points. He later joked about it in interviews, saying he never even went to class, but the truth was simple. George Wendt was completely unprepared for college life, and he had no idea what he was doing there in the first place. After getting kicked out of Notre Dame, he transferred to Rockhurst College in Kansas City, Missouri, a smaller Jesuit school where he eventually earned a degree in economics. But even with a diploma in hand, he was still searching for purpose. He wasn't particularly drawn to finance, business, or any traditional field, and he was constantly searching for a roadmap or a spark. That spark finally came when he signed up for a class at the Second City, the legendary Chicago improv comedy troupe that had already launched the careers of icons like Bill Murray, John Belushi, and Gilda Radner. However, initially, he didn't join as a performer, but as part of the technical crew. He swept floors, painted sets, and did whatever backstage work was needed. But as fate would have it, one day, one of the performers didn't show up, and George was thrown on stage to fill in. Just like that, the awkward kid from Southside Chicago who'd failed out of college and had no clear plan suddenly found himself under the lights and loving it. From that moment forward, George Wendt threw himself into the world of improv and sketch comedy. He officially joined the Second City Ensemble and spent years performing live in front of packed crowds. He had this down-to-earth presence that made people instantly like him. And little by little, he mastered the art of dry humor, comic timing, and character work. By the late 1970s and early 80s, George had begun picking up small roles in television and film like My Bodyguard and Airplane 2. He also did a few guest spots on shows like Taxi. And although they weren't glamorous parts, they were paying the bills and slowly building his resume. Then came 1982, the year that everything changed for George. NBC was developing a new sitcom about a Boston bar called Cheers. The producers were looking for actors who could carry a comedic tone without losing the authenticity of real, everyday people. They didn't want models or stars. They wanted actors who felt like someone you could actually run into at your local bar. George Wendt auditioned for the role of Norm Peterson, a bar regular with a deadpan wit and a mysterious home life. In the script he was given, Norm only had one line, and it was just a single word, beer. But George made it count. When he walked into the audition room and delivered that line, the producers couldn't stop laughing. Not because the word itself was funny, but because the way George said it was. There was something in his voice that said everything you needed to know about the character. The creators offered him the role on the spot, and just like that, George Wendt stepped into television history. Cheers premiered on September 30th, 1982. The pilot didn't initially draw huge ratings, but critics loved it. NBC stuck with the show, and slowly the audience started to grow. Week after week, people tuned in to see the familiar setting, the witty banter, and of course, Norm walking into the bar to a chorus of Norm. Over the course of 11 seasons and 275 episodes, Cheers became one of the most iconic sitcoms in television history. It wasn't just funny, it was smart, character-driven, and emotionally rich. It made viewers feel like they belonged to that little bar in Boston. And Norm Peterson, he became one of the most beloved sitcom characters of all time. George Wendt played him in every single episode, bringing comic relief and heart to the show. Norm's deadpan humor, work complaints, and off-screen marriage woes became iconic parts of the show, and George brought life into the character every single time. For his work on Cheers, he was nominated for 6 Primetime Emmy Awards. The show itself won 28 Emmys and 6 Golden Globes and was ranked by TV Guide as one of the greatest shows of all time. But more than the awards or ratings, Cheers changed television. It proved that you didn't need a flashy premise or a high-concept hook. You just needed strong writing, unforgettable characters, and the right actors to bring them to life. On camera, the gang at Cheers felt like a tight-knit family, always ready with a joke, a drink, or a knowing look. But most people never realized that behind the scenes, there were long-held grudges, dramatic exits, and years of simmering tension that never quite made it into the script. Behind-the-scenes challenges of Cheers. While Cheers ran like a well-oiled machine on screen, behind the camera, things weren't always so harmonious. For a show built on comedy, comfort, and chemistry, it hid some deeply personal feuds that lasted for years, even decades. And although George Wendt rarely made headlines for on-set drama and was widely known as one of the most laid-back and easygoing members of the cast, that didn't save him from being affected by the tensions unfolding around him. One of the most unexpected feuds brewed beneath the surface for years, and it was between Ted Danson and Kelsey Grammer. On screen, their characters, Sam Malone and Frasier Crane, didn't always see eye to eye. And apparently, neither did the actors. Ted Danson had been the face of Cheers from the very beginning. As the former Red Sox pitcher turned bartender, he carried the show's charisma and confidence. But when Kelsey Grammer joined the cast in Season 3 as the pompous psychiatrist Frasier Crane, a new dynamic entered the room, and it wasn't all friendly. At first, it was subtle. There were whispers of Grammer stealing scenes, over-delivering lines, and pushing his character into more spotlight than the writers originally intended. Some insiders say Ted felt threatened, that Grammer's rising popularity was pulling attention away from his character. However, both Grammer and Ted have revealed that they never had any argument in particular, but a series of misunderstandings. As the seasons wore on, and Grammer's character became a staple of the show, the distance between the two actors reportedly grew. They remained professional on set, but it was clear there was no real friendship between them off-screen. And for years, they simply tolerated each other. George Wendt, always the calm in the storm, was said to avoid getting in the middle of it. But cast tensions have a way of seeping into the cracks. When the air is thick on set, even the most easygoing actors feel it. George may have never chosen sides, but he certainly witnessed the cold shoulder moments and silent lunches that others preferred to pretend weren't happening. But no behind-the-scenes story from Cheers is complete without mentioning Shelley Long. Shelley played Diane Chambers, the pretentious intellectual who walked into the bar in Episode 1 and never quite fit in, which was exactly the point. Her sharp contrast to Sam and her long-running on-again, off-again romance with him were central pieces of the show's early success. But Shelley's time on Cheers wasn't easy for her or anyone around her. She was notoriously difficult to work with, often clashing with producers and questioning the writing. Some called her a perfectionist, others called her controlling, and many cast members have spoken over the years about how Shelley would isolate herself from the rest of the group, rarely joining in the lighthearted moments or post-rehearsal hangouts that helped bond the team. It all came to a head in 1987 when Shelley Long made the controversial decision to leave Cheers at the height of its popularity. She wanted to pursue a film career and felt she had taken Diane as far as she could. But behind closed doors, there was more to the story. Reports suggest Shelley had grown increasingly frustrated with the show's direction and even with her co-stars. Some producers claimed she was impossible to write for. Others said the rest of the cast simply grew tired of accommodating her demands. George Wendt, once again, kept a low profile through all of it, but Shelley's departure and the ripple effects it caused certainly impacted everyone involved. The bar wasn't quite the same without Diane, and while the show remained successful, the tone shifted. New characters were introduced, the dynamic evolved, but that old tension and the feeling that things were never quite as friendly off-screen as they seemed on camera lingered. And even after Cheers ended in 1993, the wounds didn't fully heal. It wasn't until 2024, more than 30 years after the final season, that Ted Danson and Kelsey Grammer were seen publicly reconciling during a televised reunion panel. They smiled, they reminisced, and they addressed the old feud with a sense of reflection. Both men admitted there had been tension, but they expressed mutual respect for each other's work. Of course, George Wendt, who by that time had become the quiet elder statesman of the group, remained the same calming presence he'd always been. But even for someone as grounded as George, spending over a decade in the middle of that emotional tug-of-war likely took a toll. Although the laughter at the Cheers set might have drowned out the noise for a while, however, once the credits rolled, some stars found themselves facing scandals that followed them for years. The controversies that haunted the Cheers cast. While Cheers was winning Emmys and topping ratings charts, some of its biggest stars were dealing with chaos behind closed doors. These weren't just personal slip-ups. They were national headlines that impacted their careers, families, and even the legacy of Cheers. The most explosive controversy came from the show's leading man, Ted Danson. By the early 1990s, Danson had become one of television's most recognizable faces. He has played the charming, womanizing bartender Sam Malone in Cheers, and off-screen, his reputation for charm followed him into high-profile circles. That's where he met comedian and actress Whoopi Goldberg. But what began as a professional collaboration turned into a highly publicized affair. The problem was that at the time, Ted Danson was still married. His wife at the time, Casey Coates, had supported his rise to fame and had been by his side since before Cheers ever aired. When the affair with Goldberg became public, it didn't just destroy the marriage, it created a media storm. The press constantly followed Danson and Goldberg, dissecting every appearance, every statement, and every moment of their controversial relationship. The fallout was immediate and costly. Although the affair wasn't the only deciding factor, Ted Danson and Casey Coates finalized their divorce in 1993. The settlement was one of the most expensive in Hollywood history at the time, estimated at around $30 million. The story dominated tabloids and talk shows, overshadowing even the end of Cheers itself. Fans were divided. Some saw Danson as a man caught in a media frenzy, while others viewed him as a symbol of Hollywood hypocrisy, playing the nice guy on TV while betraying his family behind the scenes. But Ted wasn't the only Cheers star who faced personal demons in public. Kelsey Grammer, who portrayed the refined and eloquent Dr. Frasier Crane, lived a personal life that was anything but composed. Grammer's troubles began long before Cheers even ended. By the early 1990s, he was battling addiction, first to alcohol, then to illicit substances. He was arrested more than once, including for a high-profile driving under the influence and an illegal substance possession charge. His personal life unraveled in front of millions of fans, and he cycled through rehab stints, failed relationships, and legal fights that made him a regular tabloid fixture. But that's not all. In 1996, he was sued for alleged inappropriate behavior by his daughter's babysitter. Though the charges were eventually dropped, the damage to his public image was real. For a while, it looked like Kelsey Grammer might lose everything he had built. But he held on, landed a spin-off series with Frasier, and somehow managed to pull himself out of the worst of it. Still, the shadows of addiction and controversy followed him well into the 2000s. George Wendt, meanwhile, kept a much lower profile during all of this, but that didn't mean he was unaffected. Watching colleagues self-destruct publicly, even while trying to preserve the brand and legacy of Cheers, must have been an exhausting and painful process. George himself has never had his name splashed across the tabloids for a scandal. That was never his path. But navigating a workplace where the outside world kept crashing in through gossip, lawsuits, and media firestorms was a lot to deal with. But when the final episode of Cheers was aired, most of the cast scattered. Some made headlines, some completely reinvented themselves. George Wendt, however, entered a quieter chapter. But his journey after Cheers wasn't as simple as it seemed. What waited beyond wasn't the comfort of retirement or the security of lasting fame. It was a new chapter filled with quiet battles, challenges, and a gradual fading from the spotlight. George's struggles after Cheers. George Wendt was more than just the character, Norm Peterson. But for millions of viewers, that's exactly who he remained. So, when Cheers ended in 1993, Wendt had become synonymous with the friendly, beer-loving bar regular who could deliver a punchline with nothing more than a sigh and a one-liner. It was the kind of role most actors dream of, but also the kind that can become a shadow. Unfortunately, breaking away from that identity proved difficult. In the years after Cheers, George Wendt took on a variety of roles across theater, television, and film. He appeared in sitcoms, late-night shows, animated voiceovers, and the occasional cameo that played on his fame from Cheers. He even headlined his own short-lived series, The George Wendt Show, in 1995. It lasted only a few episodes before being canceled, because viewers couldn't separate the actor from Norm. Still, Wendt remained busy. He took roles in Broadway and regional theater productions, including playing Edna Turnblad in Hairspray and Santa Claus in seasonal productions. Although his presence brought a sense of warmth and familiarity, the mainstream spotlight had clearly moved on from him. But that wasn't the only problem, because behind the scenes, the physical demands of a long career and decades of being known for his size soon began to catch up with him. George Wendt had battled weight issues for most of his adult life. While it became a defining trait of the character Norm, it also placed a silent pressure on George himself. Over time, the public image of the jolly, overweight bar regular began to clash with his health concerns. In 2012, he underwent coronary bypass surgery after tests had revealed that an artery leading to his heart was severely constricted. Although he made a full recovery, friends and colleagues soon noticed a change, not just in his energy levels, but in his overall mobility. Wendt began walking more slowly. He was frequently seen using support to manage stairs and long distances. At events, he often sat during photography sessions. But these weren't just signs of aging. They were clear indications that his health was starting to deteriorate. There were also other visible signs that something was off. In interviews and panel appearances, fans noticed George's labored breathing, and some of his closest friends, including former castmates, began to quietly express concern for his health. However, George brushed off questions. He didn't want to be pitied, or to become a cautionary tale. He wanted to keep working, but the opportunities became fewer. Television roles became guest appearances. Commercials and cameos often leaned on nostalgia rather than new material. In fact, his cameos felt more like tributes than career revivals, and it was clear that the industry loved him, but from a distance. And through it all, George kept showing up. He kept making people laugh. He kept saying yes to the offers that came. But behind the curtain, his world was shrinking. Traveling had become more difficult, as had walking short distances. Even standing for too long seemed to exhaust him. There were even rumors of oxygen tanks being brought to hotel rooms, assistants accompanying him more frequently, and a sharp decline in public appearances after 2020. Unlike other stars who use their later years to stage comebacks or reinvent themselves, George Wendt chose something simpler. He stayed out of scandal. He didn't chase the limelight, but he also never fully escaped the role that defined him. That left him in a space where his health was quietly deteriorating, while most of the world still pictured him with a beer in hand and a smile on his face. Although he kept going strong, even the strongest spirits eventually slow down. And as the lights faded on his final public moments, those closest to him knew the end was near. George's final years and tragic passing. George Wendt remained a familiar presence in American pop culture well into his 70s. Though he was no longer headlining shows or dominating screens, he made it a point to stay connected to both fans and the industry that made him a legend. His appearances became less frequent, but each one carried emotional weight, especially as his health declined. One of his last widely viewed appearances came in 2023 when George surprised audiences as a contestant on The Masked Singer. Under the costume, his voice was unmistakable, though visibly slower on his feet and clearly winded at times. His participation brought smiles to longtime fans. It was a moment of joyful nostalgia and proof that even decades after Cheers, George still knew how to work a crowd. In early 2024, he reunited with surviving Cheers cast members for a special segment at the Emmy Awards, commemorating the show's enduring legacy. Ted Danson, Rhea Perlman, John Ratzenberger, and George stood together on stage, aged but smiling. The applause was thunderous, but the moment was also bittersweet. Fans noted that George appeared frail. He leaned on an assistant just off stage and was seated during most of the ceremony. Despite the effort it clearly took, George never broke the smile. He waved to fans and posed for photos. But for many, that Emmy night felt like a quiet farewell. Throughout the years, George had stayed particularly close to Ted Danson, Rhea Perlman, and John Ratzenberger. The four had shared something more than just a hit show. They had a bond that was built across 11 intense seasons of Cheers. They had weathered personal changes, industry shifts, and public pressures together. And in the quieter years, they remained in touch, not for headlines, but out of genuine care. In fact, in an interview, George's wife, Bernadette Burkett, said, "They get along like siblings." To somebody peeking in from the outside, they look like they're having the greatest time in the world. By late 2024, the concerns had become more serious. There were reports of George Wendt using mobility aids more frequently and avoiding long travel. At public appearances, he spoke less and sat more, and the fans who encountered him spoke about his labored breathing and noticeable fatigue. On May 20th, 2025, George Wendt passed away peacefully in his sleep at home. And in what many have described as a spooky coincidence, he passed away exactly 32 years after the final episode of Cheers. To many fans, this was more than just coincidence. It felt symbolic. For friends, it felt like fate. His family released a brief statement confirming his death and asking for privacy. However, no official cause of death was immediately disclosed. But multiple entertainment outlets have cited possible complications related to his heart disease and long-standing diabetes. After all, these issues had quietly affected George for years, and they weren't secrets, although George himself never made the illness part of his public identity. The response to his passing was emotional and overwhelming. Ted Danson issued a heartfelt statement within hours, saying, "I'm devastated to hear that Georgie is no longer with us. I am sending all my love to Bernadette and the children. It is going to take me a long time to get used to this. I love you, Georgie." Rhea Perlman said, "George Wendt was the sweetest, kindest man I ever met. It was impossible not to like him." While John Ratzenberger simply said, "I'll miss our conversations and the quiet moments of friendship that meant the most. My thoughts are with his wife, Bernadette, their children, and everyone who loved him." Hollywood tributes followed swiftly. Directors, writers, and former co-stars recalled working with George as a privilege. Even actors from a younger generation, many of whom had never worked with him, shared memories of watching him on Cheers and learning from his performances. But the most powerful reaction came from fans. Social media flooded with tributes, not just from celebrities, but from everyday people. Viewers remembered George Wendt as more than Norm. He was the comforting voice in the background of hard days. He was the quiet reminder that not all heroes are loud or flashy. His photo trended across platforms for days. Old clips from Cheers were shared in tribute. Fans wrote about growing up with his laugh, about rewatching episodes with their families, and about how his presence made them feel less alone. Cheers may have been fictional, but George Wendt definitely made it feel real. And when he left, it felt like something familiar had finally gone quiet. But before the end, George Wendt had a chance to look back, and he shared what the show really meant to him, beyond the fame and the influence it brought him. What did George think about Cheers? George Wendt never tried to pretend Cheers wasn't the most important chapter of his professional life. Over the years, he spoke about the show with a quiet pride and deep gratitude. He knew what it had meant to audiences, but more than that, he understood what it had done for him personally. In multiple interviews, he called it a miracle gig, not just because it lasted so long, but because of what it gave him. Cheers brought him a second family, a cultural legacy, and a permanent seat in the hearts of millions. Despite appearing in more than 270 episodes, Wendt never viewed himself as the star. He often deflected attention toward the ensemble, crediting the show's longevity to the perfect blend of writing, casting, and timing. He was especially proud of Cheers' ability to evolve. The cast changed. Writers rotated in and out. Major characters left, and the dynamic shifted. But Norm stayed because he felt real, and the fans could relate to him. In his later years, Wendt became quite philosophical about the show's place in television history. He described it not just as a success, but as a turning point for sitcoms. He believed the show's mix of comedy and character depth helped reshape the way television approached storytelling. In the days following his death, tributes focused not just on his performances, but on the comfort he brought. George Wendt never chased the spotlight or tried to reinvent himself as something he wasn't. He respected the work, respected his fans, and respected the craft of acting. His success proved that you didn't need to be the lead or the loudest voice in the room to leave a lasting mark. He gave people a character they could count on, and in doing so, became one of the most quietly iconic faces in television history. Who was your favorite Cheers character? Tell us in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.